it's October season, which means that everybody is gathering their horror movie watch lists, whether that be rewatches or new time watches. For me, I love watching those new movies that I've never seen before and trying to find those new discoveries for the year. And what I wanted to do with this is recommend some, I guess you would say, some are obscure, but mostly movies that you really don't hear a lot of people talk about when it comes to the October season. Now, some of them you've heard about a million times because they're just that good, but I kind of peppered in a little bit of the more obscure ones. So I kind of just wanted to gather these movies together and really just talk about them and recommend them to people who have never seen them before. So without further ado, let's get started. So first up on the list is something that I've loved ever since I first saw it. And I really wanted to start off with something that is bonkers, crazy, fun, and especially gory. So, what I wanted to go with is Zombie 3. So, starting off, I love Lucio Fulci's Zombie. I think that was the first Lucio Fulci movie that I saw, and for the longest time, I knew about this movie, and I also knew the behind the scenes kind of, I guess you would say, issues when it came to the directing credit because Lucio Fulci started it, but then he left the production very soon after it started filming because of he became ill, and then it was taken over by Bruno Mattei and Claudio Fragasso, and basically what results is this insane mishmash of Italian horror mixed with over-the-top gore. Basically every single type of zombie is in this movie. You've got slow zombies, you've got fast zombies, you've got talking zombies, you've got fighting zombies, you've got basically hide and seek zombies. Everything is in this movie. Oh, and there's also a flying head, which is insane. So, why should you watch this movie? I think that you should watch this movie because of the fact that it would start off your Halloween with such a bang that you would never forget it. Basically, what this could possibly do is open up the floodgates of all the other Italian horror movies in terms of a lot of the gore movies and a lot of the more just crazier foreign movies. Like I would say like a good companion piece to this is Burial Grounds, which is another movie that I absolutely love. But I wanted to go with this one because this one was a real discovery for me. I honestly thought that this would be near unwatchable, but I just had an absolute blast when I first watched this. So if you are in the mood for a zombie movie or just something crazy to start off your Halloween season with, or to show at a movie night with a group of friends, that would honestly be the best way to watch this movie, is with a big group of friends, because it does not stop. And I have a movie next up in this pile that I would honestly say is a big comparison piece to this. So that will be coming up very shortly. All right, so next up on the list is The Night Stalker and The Night Strangler. So starting off, I love the TV show Kolchak the Night Stalker. I think that that is one of the best shows to watch around the October season. It follows this reporter named Kolchak, and he investigates these supposed... It starts off as just usual crimes, or at least that's what the police think, but they're always done by some sort of monster or supernatural occurrence, and he is caught in the middle of it every single time. Now, these two are the TV movies which preceded the TV show. And these, in terms of a TV movie, are amazing. Darren McGavin, I've always loved him in anything that he appears in. And seeing him in I would say is probably his best role he ever got in his entire career. He is just on fire in both of these movies, especially The Night Stalker. And with The Night Stalker, there are scenes in it that are incredibly creepy for a TV movie. And that is something I've also tried to really try to get into this year, is watching a lot of the 70s and 80s TV movies. So if you're kind of in that mood too, I would definitely check out Dark Knight of the Scarecrow too. That is honestly probably, aside from Duel, that might be the best TV movie I've ever seen. But anyway, back to this. These are just dripping with that perfect October Halloween atmosphere. They are quick, easy, and just wonderful to watch. And if you're able to pick up a copy of both of these movies, I think that they were released through, I think, Kino Lorber on Blu-rays. I still need to pick those up, but I'll just settle for this copy. But yeah, if you've never seen these before, these are a must. So next up on the list, we've got Theater of Blood. Out of all the movies that I have in this list, this is probably the most recent movie that I've seen so far. And I was blown away by this movie. This was directed by Douglas Hickox. And I've recently this year have gotten into his filmography. I watched Sitting Target for the first time, which is also, it's a great crime movie. But one of his, I think this came after Sitting Target, actually, now that I think about it. But he made Theater of Blood, which is, I would say, out of all of Vincent Price's performances, this one just blew me away. He is just fantastic in this movie, especially towards the end and also the flashback sequences in this movie. So the premise of this movie is Vincent Price plays this Shakespearean actor who, through a series of flashbacks, you start to learn his backstory and everything, and you start to learn that he is seeking revenge against this group of theater critics, and he's killing them off one by one in very elaborate ways. And I love the structure, because if you don't know the plot of this movie going into it, it starts off incredibly surreal towards the beginning of this movie. So you have this police investigator checking out this warehouse. And basically throughout the duration of the opening, he is going through this entire warehouse and sees this large group of homeless people. And he continues walking through the entirety of this large room where they're all sleeping and everything. And the editing starts to pick up as he's doing this, as it cuts to the faces of the homeless people, and they start to give off this sinister vibe to them as they're watching this investigator kind of walk through their bedding and everything. And they basically start to gang up on him, and they almost act like zombies basically, and they end up stabbing him multiple times. And then you find out that one of the people that were there the entire time was Vincent Price in disguise. And it's insane that the movie starts off like that, but it really is intriguing. I've heard some people compare this to The Abominable Dr. Phibes. In fact, some people have even called this like a parody of Dr. Phibes. I don't really agree with the parody part, but it's definitely maybe inspired by it in some parts. But in terms of between Dr. Phibes and Theater of Blood, I prefer Theater of Blood, honestly. Like, this movie just blew me away in every single way. And some of the death scenes for the critics are just insane that you just have to see it. Especially the scene that involves this guy who loves his two poodles. When I saw that, my jaw hit the floor. All right, next up, we're going back to Bonkers, and we're going with Spookies. So, if you've never heard of Spookies, then the best way I can describe this movie is two movies that they just, are separate entities, and they just came together and formed this weird, deformed baby called Spookies. That's essentially what happened during the production of this movie. Is you had this movie that was almost finished, and I may be getting some of the details wrong, so I'll kind of paraphrase them. But there's a fantastic documentary on this release that goes into the whole behind the scenes of what happened with this movie. But I think the producers ended up seeing the rough cut of it, and they ended up shelving the first version of it. And then they brought in another director to basically film these scenes with this wizard corpse thing that honestly it kind of reminds me of the Crypt Keeper a little bit from Tales from the Crypt, and then a whole bunch of rubber monsters. And you have never seen a movie that has so many monsters in it. If you like monsters, I would go with Spookies, because there are an endless amount. Every single scene there is literally a new monster, and all of the effects, well, most of them, almost all the effects are amazing, especially the Spider-Woman thing. And if you've heard of this movie, then you've probably heard of this scene, but all I'm going to say is the farting Muckmen is probably my favorite scene in this movie. So if you've never seen Spookies, this will just give you so much enjoyment and so many monsters for your Halloween season. So next in the pile is Vamp. The basic premise is these three kids go off to this strip club, and they end up finding out that it is run by vampires. And it's a movie that all takes place over the course of one night, and that is probably my favorite subgenre in movies, if you could call it a subgenre. If a movie takes place in one night, I'm there. And the style of this movie is so interesting, because basically throughout the duration of the movie, when nighttime falls, there is this whole color scheme of using purple gel lights and green gel lights, and it gives off this really surreal feeling, like you're going through this long night and you're just getting delirious as the night continues. And as you're seeing these crazy things, just like the characters are seeing these crazy things, it becomes this wonderful experience and almost a fever dream of a movie, especially as some of the scenes are just completely bathed in this lighting scheme. When I first saw this movie, I enjoyed it, but I've really come around to really loving this movie. I know a lot of people, when they talk about movies that give off a certain vibe, everybody has those types of movies, and I would say that this is one of them, at least for me. If you allow this movie to wash over you, and for you to go along with its tone, its pace, its weird structure, its weird characters and logic, and just let it in and just allow it to wash over you, this will be a wonderful experience, especially if you're planning a Halloween horror marathon. This would be the perfect movie to play around like that midnight hour or 2 a.m. spot, because this movie gives off that same vibe of being tired, delirious, and when that sun comes up, you just feel like you've been through a real event. And that's how I would describe this movie. Alright, so next up on the list, I've actually got two movies, because they basically go hand in hand together, or at least for me they do, and that is The Return of the Living Dead and The Return of the Living Dead Part 2. Now, everybody who is a horror fan knows The Return of the Living Dead. It's one of the best zombie movies. It's one of the best horror comedies ever made. I love it. I love this movie. It perfectly captures the perfect tone and balance between horror and comedy. Because when it is horror, it is scary. But then it undercuts those with these wonderful, dark comedic moments. And one of the highlights of this movie, and you probably know what I'm going to say, is Clu Gulager. His delivery of some of these lines in this movie are what make this movie work. If you're a horror movie fan, you need to give this movie a try. And this is just such essential Halloween viewing. Now, with that said, there is The Return of the Living Dead Part 2. Now, this is kind of a little bit of a difficult one to talk about, because this movie definitely has its love and also its hate. And I completely understand both. I would completely understand if somebody saw this movie and hated it. Hated how it reuses a lot of the characters from the first one, how it really doesn't make sense in terms of the timeline of events at the end of this movie. It's honestly basically, it's a little bit of a reimagining almost of the first movie. If you hate this movie, I understand. I, however, kind of fall onto the side of loving this movie. It's goofy. It is way more of a comedy than a horror movie, and a lot of the comedy does not work, but there is this certain charm to this movie that I love. And for some reason, whenever I think of an 80s horror movie, I don't know why, but I honestly think of the suburban setting that this movie takes place in. It kind of takes place in the same type of suburb that's kind of being developed, and all the homes are almost the same, and it reminds me of E.T. and Poltergeist. It has that type of vibe to it, but when I think of a 80s horror movie, I think of that environment for some reason, and that is exactly what this is. So I really do think of this as just a horror movie that I always go back to and I always think of whenever I think of the word 80s horror. It honestly basically follows the same plot as this. I mean, there are some differences, but you do have the same, you've got the Tar Man, you've got the same characters as Freddy, and then you also have the trioxin canisters, and then you've got zombies. I mean that's just given the fact that it's Return of the Living Dead. But I don't know. I've always loved this movie ever since I saw it as a kid. So if you saw this movie a while back and you really didn't like it, but let's say that you've wanted to give it another shot, I would give it another shot. So as a double feature, I think that these movies work well. You really are not getting the same, I guess, flavor throughout this double feature. And to me, that actually makes each one of them stick out a little bit more instead of blending together all into one. And if you've been on the fence of trying to see this movie again, I really would give this movie another shot. Or at the very least, watch them as a double feature and just enjoy the ride. So next up on the list is one of my favorite movies of all time, Rituals. The basic premise of this movie is you've got 5 doctors that go out on this hiking trip in the Canadian wilderness. And they're slowly stalked and eventually picked off one by this crazed maniac that is hiding out in the woods. And through the duration of the movie, you never see this person. The closest you ever come to seeing the person, basically, is through these very far off distant shots, and where you basically only see an outline or a quick glimpse of a figure standing in the horizon. And to me, that was just, it's so unsettling to see. That combined with the score of this movie, which really helps sell the dread of some of the situations that these characters find themselves in. Hal Holbrook in this movie is one of my favorite horror performances ever, especially towards the end when he really does have to go through a wide range of emotions when he's holed up in this cabin and he's having to make these really quick split-second decisions. It is great. And a lot of the times when I watch slasher movies or horror movies where they have the villain of the movie obscured with a mask, or you don't see them a lot of the times, I'm always looking for that villain or the antagonist that is truly scary. And not only scary, but really scary looking. And a lot of the times when they have that big reveal in the end of a lot of horror movies where it really doesn't do justice to some of the dread that's built up in some of the movies. But I think that this pulls it off so well, because when you see the actual face of the person that is doing this, it is horrifying. And they linger on it just perfectly enough to where you get a good idea of what he looks like, but it still leaves a lot up to your imagination. And I think that this movie is one of the best horror movies, one of the best movies of the 70s in general. I really do think that this is such a highly underrated movie that everybody should check out, especially this Halloween. So next up on the list is probably a movie that has the biggest divide in terms of fans. There are people that love this movie, and then there are people that hate this movie. And I'm talking never want to see it again and just hate every single minute of this movie. And I don't know how I grew to love this experience of watching this movie, but I really do fall on the side of loving this movie. And I just think it's a wonderful October viewing experience, and that is Malatesta's Carnival of Blood. Like I said, there are a lot of people that hate this movie, and I completely get it. There are long stretches of this movie where not a lot happens, and this is probably one of the closest experiences to having a cinematic fever dream, because a lot of this movie is just long stretches of people wandering through these crazy environments with this droning soundtrack in these, I guess, like zombie people giving off this really chilling moaning sound. And a lot of the set decoration in this movie is insane. I mean, there is bubble wrap galore all over this movie. I think I just watched this movie at the most perfect time, because when I first watched this movie, I had just got an Arrow streaming service, and I didn't know much about the American Horror Project that this was a part of. And it was around October, and I just kind of threw it on without knowing nothing about it. It was, I think, like 12 o'clock at night, which I think just enhanced the experience of going into this almost dreamlike state as I watched this movie. Out of any other movie that I have talked about on this list, if you allow this movie to wash over you and just go along with its logic and its long stretches of not a lot happening, I think that for some people, this will grow into a must-watch October viewing, like it has me. I think that this is one of the best prime examples of how there are movies out there for everybody. Everybody has those movies where they almost feel alone in terms of loving a movie as much as they do, and I would say that this is one of them, where I'm as shocked as anybody else when it comes to loving this movie as much as I do, because I think if any other day I would have hated this movie. I would have hated the long stretches of nothing happening, but I've really just grown to really love this movie, especially that first viewing experience. And I went back and I've rewatched this multiple times because I've wanted to make sure that this was not just that first time experience of watching something crazy and the environment was like the perfect environment to watch this movie. And it's held up for me. It really has. So if you're looking for something very weird, surreal, and also scratches that regional horror itch, I would really try to go with this movie. It's very short. I think it's an hour and 17 minutes. Or, no, actually, it's an hour and 14 minutes, so it's even shorter. And just give this a try. You know, I think it's a wonderful October viewing experience. Alright, so the second to last movie on the list is Frogs. How can I accurately describe the wonderfulness of frogs? Basically, just with this image, and also the poster, which is just wonderful. I love nature run amok movies. It's one of my favorite subgenres, and this was one of the first ones I ever saw. It's not a good movie. I'm just gonna say that right off the bat. It's really not a good movie, but it's so fun. It's such an enjoyable movie. You got basically every single animal that exists in a swamp is out to just kill anybody in sight. So you have so many animal just attack scenes. You've got alligators, you've got leeches, you've got snakes, everything. You've got birds, and all the while, as you watch this movie, you keep cutting back to these frogs, which there's also toads in the movie. Just it almost seems like they're like controlling the animals, but like that's not what the plot is. But just the way that it's structured, it almost seems that way. You have this weird family dynamic with Ray Milland in the center of this, who gives a wonderfully bad performance. I think I love Ray Milland in general. I think he's a really good actor, but in this movie, it like crosses the line into just something else. And you also get a early performance by Sam Elliott, which you can definitely hear it in the voice, but in terms of, you know, he doesn't have the mustache or anything. So it honestly, for the first couple times I watched this when I was younger, I had no idea that was Sam Elliott. And I think I heard about it just, you know, like listening to like a video or a podcast or anything like that. And they were like, oh yeah, Sam Elliott. I was like, what? That was Sam Elliott? It's insane. And so yeah, I think for a bad movie night for Halloween, you gotta go with Frogs. It's wonderful. Just give it a shot. And last up on the list is, again, a movie that I watched when I was younger and I instantly loved it, and that is Fido. This is a movie that is honestly kind of been lost to time a little bit. It came out in 2006, and as a zombie premise, just when you thought that zombie movies were getting stale in the mid 2000s, and especially now, this movie goes and does something different. It basically takes the premise of a 1950s family who gets a new dog and basically replaces the dog with a zombie. So this takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where the world has been ravaged by zombies, and you have these small pockets of towns where they have been able to form this collar that is able to be attached to the zombie, and they're able to basically domesticate the zombies. And then you follow this one family who gets this zombie, and the boy ends up befriending the zombie and naming him Fido. And it really does follow the formula of basically replace Fido with just a dog. And this is wonderful. It's a really surprisingly touching movie. You really do start to feel for the relationship between this kid and this zombie. And he really does grow to have a personality to him. But the two best parts of this movie are Tim Blake Nelson and Dylan Baker. They steal every single scene that they are in this movie, especially Tim Blake Nelson, who plays the neighbor to this family. And man, just talking about this movie makes me want to watch it right now because it is a very good forgotten horror comedy. And that also has a very, I would say, bittersweet ending to it. So if you're kind of in the mood for, I guess you would say, like almost like a feel good horror movie. I mean, there are some parts that are a little dark, but in the end, it will definitely put a smile on your face if you know are liking it up to that point. So if you've never heard of this movie and you really are in the mood for a zombie movie, but you want something a little bit different, or you know, a different flavor of zombie movie, I would definitely go with Fido. Wow, I was not expecting to go that long. So I don't know how long this will be in terms of the final edited version, but let me check the time. I've been talking for about an hour. So yeah, that was basically kind of some of the horror movies that I kind of wanted to spotlight. Some of the movies where you really don't hear a lot of people talk about them. And I wanted to have the opportunity to talk about them and to show them to people who maybe they're not on their radar and maybe they're looking for those last couple of movies to add to their watch list, especially as we approach Halloween. And I would love to hear other suggestions from other people, and you know, what are those quintessential Halloween movies that you just love watching every single year that never grow old. And yeah, I would love to hear about those. So take care.